I'm going to introduce Tess. She sent me a little bio here. Tess Whittyfield is the Acting Executive Director at Shelterbox Canada. Tess started her journey into the non-profit world at I hope I pronounced that right, Brescia University College at Western University, earning a degree in International Community Development. Tess has been a member of the Shelterbox team since 2014, working to promote the Rotary Project partnership and fundraising campaigns in Canada. Tess is currently the Foundation Chair at the Rotary Club of Toronto Twilight, and in her spare time can be found doing something creative or cheering for the Raptors. So welcome, Tess.
Wonderful.
And if you could all put yourselves on mute, please, while she does a presentation. Okay.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much for the intro. And I've got a presentation to share with you. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. As Gordon mentioned, I am a fellow Rotarian. This is doing presentations on Wednesdays is always sort of my favorite, as I also have my Rotary Club meeting this evening. So it's double duty for me today. So thank you for having me this afternoon. So I'm here to speak to you today about Shelterbox Canada and some of the updates and information for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with Shelterbox. I know the club has been a fantastic supporter of our work in the past. So for some of you, you know, a refresher and of course, give an update about our work in response to the coronavirus pandemic. So right now, every year we see new numbers of how many families and people have been affected by natural disaster and conflict around the world. And last year, more than 104 million people around the world were left homeless due to natural disasters or conflict. And that number is raising every year. The year prior, it was 85 million, and we're expected to continue to see a rise, unfortunately, due to the changing climate, due to, you know, growing conflict around the world. And on average, only about 1 in 5 families actually receive the emergency support and shelter that they actually need after losing their home. So the need is huge, and Shelterbox Canada and Shelterbox globally, we're really working to meet that need. And we really believe that shelter really, and recovery starts with shelter. That recovery is a process for families and communities to go on. That's not just about getting them that emergency piece of aid right away, but really supporting them to have the training and resources that they need to be able to rebuild and hopefully rebuild back better. We know a lot of times communities we're working in are impacted by prolonged conflict areas or are struck by disasters multiple times in a year. And so that's really what Shelterbox aims to do. We're an international disaster relief organization that hand delivers emergency shelter and essential items to families around the world. And we believe that we have a commitment not just to those affected by disaster and conflict, but really to everybody who supports us, from your Rotary Club supporters around the world and here in Canada. And we're impatient to really see a world where no family is left without shelter. And so when we think about what shelter really means, you know, we're an organization that really primarily focuses on shelter, as I mentioned, but we know it's more than just a roof. We know, especially right now, as we're all sheltering in place, we're all physically distancing and, you know, really recognizing the importance of having a safe home to be in right now, especially, and as the months start to get a little bit colder, maybe not this weekend, but probably soon, you know, we know the importance of what safe shelter means and what it means to have a home. And so we know we can't replace everything that a family has lost, but we can start again to kickstart that process of recovery for families and communities. We know that shelter can provide warmth in bitter cold. It can provide protection from the burning sun. It can also provide a place for families to cook meals together, for communities to gather, for kids to be able to continue their schoolwork. So it's really the foundation of sort of all of the work that, all of the support that families and communities need. And so we're constantly monitoring. We know that lots of disasters are happening all of the time. Some of them make the news, but many of them don't, especially right now with such a busy news cycle. And so we have to really do whatever it takes to reach as many families as possible. And so we're constantly monitoring new disasters and conflict areas, really making careful assessments to ensure that the aid that we have to provide is reaching the most vulnerable families and communities. We look at things like how many families have been impacted, has the government of the country that's been impacted requested international assistance, what's the likelihood for the government or local actors and community groups to support families, or do they need that extra assistance from us? So looking at so many different factors and ultimately making really challenging decisions at times to know where to respond. Like I said, only 1 in 5 families are receiving that aid, and so the need is so huge. At Shelterbox, we're a global organization with 15 affiliates around the world, all raising funds to support families. And so while we're reaching more and more families every year, we know, as I said, that need is really growing. So it's about making careful assessments to make sure that we're supporting some of the most vulnerable. And we really also know that every community, every family that we're working with is different. And so we pride ourselves on really having a very flexible approach. We're listening and we're learning from families and community leaders to understand what their needs are, never making assumptions about what we think families or communities need, but really listening and adapting our aid package, adapting and growing and sort of changing what we're providing to meet their needs. Especially right now, and I'll speak about that in a bit, is sort of these new needs within the face of this coronavirus pandemic. And so sometimes it means that we're packing our aid inside of our iconic green shelter box, which I'm sure many of you, especially as Rotarians, have seen before at district conferences or zones or at conventions. But sometimes it means also providing a bit of a different aid package with our shelter kit so families can rebuild. And so I mentioned our sturdy green shelter boxes. Again, our most sort of common, it's what we're well known for, it's what our logo and name is. It's this idea of packing everything that a family might need into this big green box. So our family size tent, all of the tools and sort of fixings that a family might need. So things like water filters, solar lights, mosquito nets, packed inside of this one-stop sort of solution for families. This is a really great solution for families who have lost everything. We need that immediate emergency shelter of a tent. And our tent, if you've ever had a chance to be in one, it's a little bit more intense than your standard camping tent that you might take out with your family. This one is actually waterproof, it's UV protected, it can withstand 100-kilometer-per-hour winds and heavy rains, and it can really keep a family safe and dry in up to 6 inches of standing water. We know a lot of times when we're working in these disaster areas, especially, that if one disaster or flooding or rain comes through, typically there's another storm surge, and we need to make sure that families are always left safer than they were prior to us arriving. So again, setting families up on that process of recovery, whatever that looks like. And so I mentioned, that the box and the tent is a great solution for families who might have lost everything. But over the years, we really identified that while that was a great solution and still remains fantastic for some situations, we didn't really have a solution for a number of years for families who maybe needed to repair their roof or their wall, or actually wanted to really start rebuilding their shelter right away and, rebuilding a more locally appropriate shelter than maybe a tent might be. And so that's where our shelter kits come in. They're 2 heavy-duty tarps and a hoe, shovel, hammer, sort of all of the pieces that a family might need, and nails and things like that, so that a family can repair or rebuild. And you can see here on the right-hand side is a photo from Dominica, and that was from Hurricane Irma and Maria 3 years ago now, of a family actually using locally sourced timber, working oftentimes with local trainers, whether that's carpenters, Rotarians with expertise in building, to actually use our materials to build back stronger and build back a more secure and sort of stable long-term shelter than just a tent might be. So now we can really support families with whatever they need to meet that new shelter requirement, whether it's that tent for that immediate sort of, shelter and security, or whether it's providing them with the tools that they need to actually rebuild or repair their home. And of course, alongside either of those solutions, as I mentioned, also comes things like our water filters, our solar lights, mosquito nets, things like cooking equipment and rope. So all of the things that help to make that brand new house a home, that can help bring families or communities together and provide them with the essentials like light and clean water, especially right now, clean water, not only for drinking, but also for proper hand washing hygiene, is so important for families who have, lost everything, or who, are also facing threats of mosquito-borne illnesses or water, contamination. So providing that whole selection of 8 items, and again, really specific and flexible to not only each response and each deployment, but also each individual family, even within a deployment. And to me, one of my favorite stories, it's sort of an older story, but a good one, is the story of Eliza. And in 2015, our response team members met Eliza in Malawi after flooding had impacted her community. A lot of her homes, as you can see her kind of leaning against it here, are made with brick, sort of mud bricks. And so a lot of the homes in her community had washed away. Eliza, when they met, was 21 years old. She was blind and epileptic, and she was caring for her younger brother, who's shown there in the photo as well. And she was the primary caregiver for her family. And so when our teams met her, it was really at the beginning of us using shelter kits commonly in our deployments. And while a lot of people in her community were receiving tents to, again, kind of pitch that emergency shelter immediately, for Eliza, she really wanted to still be able to navigate her home by touch, by memory, given that she was blind, and be able to care for her family in a way that she knew how. And so we were actually able to provide her with the shelter kit so that she could actually repair her home. So she could keep the structure of it, she could keep the layout, sort of the things that she was familiar with, but still meet her emergency shelter needs, still be able to support her on her process of recovery. And over the years, as we've sort of changed and grown as the way that we provide aid, we've also grown in the work that we do. We were founded in 2000. We're celebrating globally our 20 years of disaster relief this year. And it grew actually from a Rotary Club, which is always an exciting story to tell. And so we grew as a Millennial Club project of a Rotary Club in Cornwall in the UK. And it was this idea, again, of packaging up essential aid items into a box and shipping them to families who needed it. And we've since grown, of course, since then into our own organization, separate of Rotary, but a Rotary Club project. And so a Rotary project partner, rather, of Rotary International, now supporting over 1.5 million people since we started in 2000, working in over 97 countries around the world. And we're constantly responding. We're currently responding to 9 countries right now. Again, those ones that are in the news and the ones that don't make it. So constantly busy, especially now, responding to support as many families as we can every year. And I mentioned that partnership with Rotary, and it's really one that I think sets us apart, but also allows us to really to have a greater impact around the world. We've grown, as I mentioned, in 2012, have become recognized as Rotary International's project partner in disaster relief. And Rotary really supports us in many ways, between the generous support of clubs like yours who make donations to our work, but also to the on-the-ground assistance. This photo is from a few years ago in Indonesia after the earthquake, and we actually worked alongside the Rotary disaster relief groups in Indonesia, in the districts there, alongside the district governors, to be able to support families with Rotary. So we find often Rotarians, as we know, we're connected in our communities, we're people of action, we're wanting to make a difference. And so with Rotary being in so many countries around the world, really tapping into the incredible network that we as Rotarians have. And with that often comes, a really next level kind of partnership, both supporting Rotary and their initiatives that we're doing around the world, but also gaining the support. We've had generous donations from Rotarians around the world of our warehouse spaces, of helicopters in Guatemala to assess the damage after a volcano eruption a few years ago, to volunteers and staff in our organization, over 1,000 Rotarians within the Shelterbox organization worldwide. So it's really at the sort of heart and DNA of our organization, and it's really why I became a Rotarian myself. I was with Shelterbox for a number of years before I decided that really becoming a Rotarian was a good fit for me as well. So I'm really integrated into the work that we're doing as an organization. And of course, I wanted to take some time to speak about as well the really new impacts of coronavirus. We, of course, as everybody else, have had to pivot to meet this new need. And quite quickly, when this pandemic really started in March and April, when we were getting our heads around what was going on and how we would need to respond, it became quite clear that we needed to adapt because of the importance of shelter. We know that if we're working to flatten that global curve, under this sort of understanding that this really isn't over until it's over everywhere, that shelter was going to be a key factor in mitigating that global spread. And so we're already working, again, with some of the most vulnerable communities at times, already working in a lot of refugee camps and areas around the world. And so what could we do to really step up our aid provision during this time to support even more families? And so in the space of coronavirus, we, again, knew shelter would mean so much more. We know it can help to slow that spread, giving people privacy, but the safety of their own shelter, and being able to actually have the opportunity to physically distance. And we know also that cyclones and earthquakes, right now we're tracking a super typhoon in the Philippines and a hurricane that's moving across Nicaragua right now. And we know disasters are going to continue to happen during this pandemic. So what can we do to ensure that not only are we supporting them with these new shelter needs, but also doing so safely in the face of this pandemic? And so we've had to adapt. We've had to adapt the way that we work and the aid that we provide. And so we're adapting to provide even more shelter, especially in areas like Cameroon and Nigeria, where we've been working for a number of years, supporting families fleeing Boko Haram violence. We're working to help move people out of collective centers and areas so that they aren't staying in close-knit collective centers, but are getting into their own emergency shelter, providing essential household items like cooking equipment so that families can cook on their own. As I mentioned, water sanitation units so that they have clean drinking water, but also clean water for hand washing. And we've also expanded our aid collection as well to include things like soap, wash basins, and now masks as well. So not something that we typically would have provided, but recognized as we're providing aid during this time, we need to also pivot to be able to support families in the way that they need right now. And so one of the ways that we've also had to adapt, as I mentioned, is we currently rely really heavily on our Shelterbox response team volunteers. So these are volunteers as well as staff members who deploy at any time around the world to support families, working with local governments, local partners, and Rotarians to support families after a disaster. And as we know, with so many travel restrictions right now, that just isn't possible. And so we've really had to lean on our partners in country, both Rotary clubs and Rotary leaders, as well as other organizations that we often partner with on the ground. And one example of this is most recently in April, we responded to Cyclone Harold, which was a cyclone that made landfall in Vanuatu. It was a Category 5 cyclone, and it destroyed thousands of homes and really caused widespread damage and power outages. And normally, as I mentioned, we would have sent in a team. We would have started doing our own assessments and determined what families needed, but we knew that wasn't going to be possible. And so we reached out to CARE, fantastic international organization who already has an in-office or sort of in-country office in Vanuatu. And we worked alongside CARE to actually provide families with shelter kits, tarps and ropes, solar lights, and kitchen sets to actually meet the needs of the communities alongside CARE. So providing the aid, working with CARE to provide training. We've also been doing a lot of, we typically train families on, how to use the kit, how to use the tent, things like that. And we've had to do that virtually. So doing meetings like this with Rotarians and our partners in Tanzania as well after flooding to provide actually virtual training. So, finding new and creative solutions to still meet these needs and still support families in this new normal. And we know that obviously coronavirus is not going anywhere anytime soon, especially in some countries that are already facing struggles in their healthcare systems prior to this. We're already facing, new disasters that are coming. And we know that it's worrisome here in Canada as well. I know with my Rotary Club, we've had to adapt how we fundraise. We typically fundraise in person and we can't do that anymore. So at Shelterbox, we're looking at how we can meet these new needs, sort of adapt to meet even more families as we know they'll need it. And most recently, I wanted to give a really quick update as well on the typhoon that I mentioned that struck on Sunday as a super typhoon Goni, which struck the Philippines on Sunday. It's the world's largest storm that we've seen so far this year, and it made landfall with winds of up to 225 kilometers per hour. We work in the Philippines often, responding last year 4 times. We have an in-country office in the Philippines and able to really support us when we know that we need to be working. We work so frequently in the Philippines. And so we're really kind of gearing up for a major response there right now. There's another super typhoon with similar strength winds headed there as well, set to make landfall tomorrow. And so we knew we know that the needs are going to be huge. So we've already committed to responding, working with our in-country office there in the Philippines, to see if we can support as many families as possible. We have, as I mentioned, that office with aid on standby for 2,000 households, but we know that the need is really going to be quite a bit greater. And we're also monitoring Hurricane Eta, which is headed right now. It's passing across Nicaragua, up the coast into El Salvador, and really we expect going to cause some damage as well in Guatemala. And so we're looking to respond there, hopefully to know some more information tomorrow once the storm has really passed, to understand what these needs are, be able to support families in the face of not only sort of the disaster, but also, again, this global pandemic. So we are busier than ever supporting as many families as we can. And I know that the club has been a generous supporter, and it's because of the past support that enables us to respond right now. So thank you so much for all of that continued support, because it means that, you know, in this unprecedented situation, that we're able to respond and we're able to support these families. And I just wanted to bring attention to, we have a new resource. I'm not sure if the club knows about, that we launched earlier this year, which is the Action Toolkit. It's a space on our website that we've made and dedicated to Rotarians and Rotary clubs to provide you with information about Shelterbox and our partnership. But really, one of my favorite parts about the toolkit is our resource center. So we've created a sort of resource training center where we worked with our training team in the UK, who actually trains our response team members. So the volunteers who are going into these high stakes environments and need to be, you know, really strong team leaders and have a really clear plan. We've worked with our training team to develop some resources that we could give back to Rotary clubs. So for communication skills, for goal setting, for different planning activities that Rotary clubs go through, sort of trying to offer back some expertise that we've got working in the field. And so I definitely encourage the club, if you're interested at all, to access some of those resources. They're there for you to use, and also just have some additional information about Shelterbox if the club is interested. And again, one thing I wanted to mention is we've just recently launched as well a campaign called Stock the Box. It's positioned out to all of our supporters, but especially Rotary clubs who are looking for ways to fundraise potentially right now for Shelterbox. I know budgets are incredibly tight this year. I know our club has had to pull back from many of these things that we had initially committed to. And so we got a lot of requests in from clubs looking for sort of ideas for how to fundraise. And so we've created Stock the Box, which allows clubs to fundraise virtually to support Shelterbox and help us really restock the aid that we now know that we're using in the Philippines and Nicaragua in the coming 2 weeks. And if that's something the club would be interested in, I'd be happy to pass along some more information about the work we're doing and campaigns as they sort of change over the next, again, few weeks as things stay very busy for us. So thank you so much for having me, and I'd be happy to open it up as well if there's any questions that anybody has, but I so appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tess. Anybody got any questions? Good.
Yes, thank you. That was very good. I mean, we have heard about Shelterbox for a long time and supported it with our club, but I don't know if I've ever seen pictures of the actual box and what's in it. I don't think I've ever seen it, so that was very helpful. My question is, when you showed the world map of countries that you support, there were a couple of surprises for me, particularly Australia and New Zealand. I mean, those were kind of the U.S. Well, you never really know, but other than the U.S., those were the only developed countries that I saw on the map. What's the need there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So over the years, we have responded to kind of what we would consider more developed countries, and typically it's in sort of when there's like Hurricane Katrina, for example, when there's such a mass overwhelming sort of need for families that really overwhelms government support. We typically responded to more, again, sort of developed countries. In our earlier years, we do less of it now. Now that we sort of have a really clear understanding of what our response criteria is, which again, I mentioned is sort of making sure that we're supporting the most vulnerable. We don't typically respond in developed countries anymore. But that being said, I mean, we know that these disasters are happening anywhere, that they don't respect, boundaries. They don't, necessarily respect politics or what's going on. And so we know we have to be prepared, really, as looking at all the information we have in front of us and making some of those tough decisions. But it's been a number of years since we've responded in sort of Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. We've never responded here in Canada, and I don't suspect that's likely to change. But really, it's adapting to meet the new needs.
Hey, Tess, I have a question, and I may have missed it in your presentation, but the sort of separate kit for repairing their current shelters, is that included in every box, or is that something separate that they request?
Yeah, that's something separate. So we provide sort of what we try to do is always provide a shelter option. So whether that's the tent or the shelter kit, and then we always provide the additional items. So whether it's those solar lights, mosquito nets, things like that. And it's always, it always looks a little bit different, even from family to family. Next door neighbors might get a little bit of a different aid package depending on things like how many people they have in their family or what their immediate needs are. But they are, two separate options that we can provide families with.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Arthur?
How much does it cost to create one of those shelter boxes?
Yeah, so it's about 1,200 Canadian dollars for a shelter box. And that's the tent and sort of what we would call more of a standard box. So all of the items for an extended family, it's about $1,200.
Anybody else? Okay, Basil, can you thank Tess formally, please?
Tess, it's been wonderful having you with us today to tell us about Shelterbox. Shelterbox organization is something that's very dear to the heart of our Rotary Club. And I know that whenever I go to a Rotary convention, one of the first booths I look for is Shelterbox, just to see what's new and what's included. I was really impressed with their box in Hamburg, and it just tells me that you're keeping up with what's needed. I think of Shelterbox as having the golden rule of not do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but do unto others as they would have you do unto them. You look for the things that are needed, especially in underdeveloped countries or countries wiped out by a disaster. And Rotary's alliance with Shelterbox assures us as Rotarians that you have good governance. You don't have to worry about your administration fees, going to a disaster area and having a good time. We know that there is good governance, and that's so reassuring. We used to think that when there was a disaster, we could donate 3 boxes and they would go to that area. And then we quickly learned that you've stockpiled shelter boxes in certain areas so that boxes we donated 2-3 years ago may be going to a typhoon or hurricane today. And the boxes we donate to today will be maybe not used for another year or 2. So we became comfortable with that. And I know that our club will continue to support Shelterbox as fundraising becomes difficult. The needs for those funds increases. And we thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. So we have other stuff to do. You're welcome to hang around, so to speak, if you want to, or if you want to leave, then that's fine too. So it's entirely up to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to skip out to get some lunch before another meeting, but I really appreciate your time and for having me. And if you ever have any questions or want any updates about our work, definitely don't hesitate to get in touch, and I'd be happy to provide you with whatever the club needs.
Okay. Thank you, Tess. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
See you again.